Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so for this episode, Where's My Mind is actually a really fun episode visually. The idea is that Angor Rot in this episode uses pixies to give everybody waking nightmares, and that results in it being a very fun episode. But yeah, that's essentially the premise of the episode. But it's really fun. It's a really fun idea, and they do play around with it a lot. But in case, that's mainly what the episode is. But in case the episode opens up and we actually meet a pixie for the first time, which is just fluttering around in the sewers, and of course, it winds up emerging in the central square of Arcadia Oaks, where Strickler happens to be walking through the streets at night, and it winds up going into his ear, and Strickler isn't entirely doesn't really realize what's going on, but then he hears a familiar voice calling him an impure, and sure enough, he turns around and discovers that Bilar is standing right behind him and just emerges from out of nowhere. And this causes Strickler to panic because he thought Bilar was dead. And of course Bilar proceeds to tell him that he survived, but only barely. And then proceeds to go on to explain how he knows about Strickler's plan, and about how he plans to use the arcane order to usurp his father's throne and left him to rot in the Darklands. And of course, Strickler is very insistent that that's not what happened, and that he's not going to abandon his master. But it's at this point where, as this is happening, a girl walks past on her phone, doesn't seem to fully understand, doesn't seem to see anything about what's going on, and it's at this point where we actually get a clue to what's happening, because she sees Strickler freaking out in the middle of the town square, but she doesn't see anything else, and then just proceeds to walk right through Bilar as he's mocking and belittling Strickler. At which point, Strickler finally figures out what's going on, and figures out that it's actually a pixie that's causing him to see Bilar. And after smacking the side of his head a little bit to dislodge the pixie from his ear, he proceeds to crush it, and with that, the illusion of Bilar just disappears. At which point, he then becomes upset with Angor Rot, who he then proceeds to who he outright is kind of angry about the fact that Angor Rot has turned has tried to use a pixie to turn against him. And of course, he quickly figures out that Angor Rot is trying to get his ring back, and of course, Angor points out that he doesn't believe that the Strickler is worthy to wield it. But it's at this point where after pointing out that he shouldn't be turning his own tricks against his master, proceeds to tell Angor that he is a dog, and that the Infernicopula is his leash, and then proceeds to essentially just turn into his troll form and attack and punch him a whole bunch until the message gets in, and that's and tells him that his mission is to kill the Trollhunter and nothing else, and tells him that now he has to do is what he says as his master, and of course Angor Rot relents and tells him that he will absolutely get right on with killing the Trollhunter. But then once Strickler leaves, he then points out that the ring will be his once again. Meanwhile, we find out a little bit more about the ring, because as we find out during the whole, there is a brief cutaway that is kind of in the episode, but I don't really know where else to put it organically in the review, so I'm just going to cover it here. But we do find out it is actually where it's supposed to go, but we do find out a little bit more about the ring, the Infernicopula, and how it got created. As we find out, Blinky is currently in his library, in his study down in Troll Market, and Arg is with him, and he then proceeds to point out that he has since figured out what the Infernicopula is, and why Jim might be in more danger than they thought, because what we find out is the Inferno Copula, and the way it's established to work is in the book that Blinky is reading. He finds out that the Inferno Copula was the result of Angor Rot making a Faustian bargain. As we find out, he wanted to become more powerful, and so he gave up his soul, which we then find out has been put inside the ring. But he gave up his soul in exchange for incredible magical power. And we find out that that's why the ring and him are connected. It contains his soul, which is what enables the wielder of the Inferno Copula to control him. However, we also find out that it's exactly because of that Faustian bargain that Angor Rot is actually, attacking Trollhunters and killing them and consuming their soul. As we find out, because he no longer, has one, so to speak. He is of course reliant on trying to fill the void, as it were, with any and all souls that he can find, which, considering the fact that he usually hunts troll hunters, which is why none of the other troll hunters have survived and lived to tell the tale about it. He's just absorbed their soul into his being to fill the void of the one that he no longer has. And of course Arg does find all this interesting, but then proceeds to kind of grimace a little bit, Blinky does note that it's been obvious as to why Arg has been avoiding him, pointing out that Arg has obviously been very distant lately, and he's picked up on that. He's noticed that Arg has been decent recently, and of course Arg thinks that it means that his secret is out. We find out a little bit more about that in this episode, because it was established in a previous episode that he got nicked by Angor Rot's knife, and of course we do find out a little bit more, and Blinky assumes that it's because of his newfound human appearance, because he's been a human for the past several episodes now. He goes on to explain how he understands why Arg has been distant, pointing out that obviously the whole transforming into a human thing has put a bit of a strain on their relationship, because obviously they're struggling to relate with each other now. Obviously Blinky is a human. He's still trying to figure out all the different problems and foibles about turning into a human and what that entails. And for that, it also means that he's able to go outside of Troll Market for extended periods of time, which means he's not spending as much time with Arg. And of course he does point out that he understands that Arg has been he believes that Arg has been feeling neglected because of that latter point. So he volunteers to fix it, and he tells Arg that though they haven't been able to go on many adventures together lately, mainly because he's been, human now, he does explain that he does plan to go and take them to a tourist destination, the world's largest thermometer. And he explains that maybe they could rent a camper, obviously something with tinted windows, so Arg doesn't turn to stone while he's out from the sunlight. But of course he points out that maybe they could go see the world's largest thermometer, and Arg can attempt to eat it, which of course would be a problem, but for a number of reasons. But of course Arg simply declines and then tells Blinky that he has to go, and this causes Blinky to become a little bit more concerned about what's going on with Arg. And it's this point where Arg goes to visit Vendel. And we do, in fact, find out why Arg has been so distant lately. We know it was established in a previous episode, but it's made a lot more explicit here. Vendel quickly realizes that Arg has been nicked by a knife coated in creeper sun poison, and he is, in fact, slowly turning to stone. And Arg asks him if he has any medicine to help with it, but of course, Vendel points out that he does have medicine, but it'll only slow the progression and not stop it completely. And points out that in time, Arg will eventually turn to stone and die. He'll turn into a stone statue and will be unable to, and will essentially be killed at that point. Of course, Arg does wonder how long he has. Vendel does give him some good news, which is that it will take weeks for the poison to completely go through his system and completely turn him to stone, and it'll take even longer with months. And it'll take with treatment. It'll take months for him to eventually turn to stone. But of course, it's at this point where Vendel does point out that he will have at some point have to tell his friends what's going on before he actually turns to stone. But Arg outright objects to that, pointing out that he doesn't want Toby to know. And Vendel understands that is in fact he understands. Vendel does understand where Arg is coming from, and does decide to help him keep his secret, pointing out that it'll just to stay between them for now. But he does point out that eventually Arg is going to have to tell somebody. He does point that out. But Arg just takes solemn comfort in the fact that Vendel will take care of him until then. But in any case, the next day. It's at this point where everybody is currently in school, and of course Mary and Darcy come to Claire and point out that they're a little surprised that Jim asks her to the spring fling and didn't say anything to them because they're best friends. And of course they immediately insist that Claire tell them everything, but Claire admits that she actually asked him because obviously Jim was having cold feet for the longest time and didn't really know how to go about asking. So she was asking him, but and this of course causes Mary to kind of fly off the handle on her a little bit, because pointing out that according to her, there's a social order. There's a social order that needs to be maintained, that they are the top of the food chain and all those other, high school things that people worry about, because I think everybody's worried about those kinds of things when they were in high school. But she goes on a whole tirade about how there's a social order and a way to do things, and that Claire needs to kind of know the rules about the world, and ask her what kind of world that she lives in. And of course Claire merely mutters under her breath if only Mary actually knew the truth. At which point Claire just kind of grins and bares her teeth as Mary just kind of continues to go on about all the mistakes she's making as the queen bee of the school and all those other things. And of course as they walk past Jim's locker, Claire just makes a face of wanting to strangle Mary, which is funny. And she winds up, and of course she makes that at Jim, and Jim fully sympathizes with that. He does point that out, but in any case, the three of them just kind of leave, and Jim goes back to about his business. At which point, after closing his locker, Toby walks in and complains about his arms being tired. And Jim points out the very obvious reason why his arms are tired. It's because it was the first day of it's because it's his first day of training, which means he's not, used to swinging around a weapon. And that it'll take some getting used to, and eventually his muscles will eventually, bulk up, and he will eventually be able to get a lot better at training. But also points out the very obvious thing that Toby picked a warhammer to use as his weapon, which of course makes sense. I mean, Jim doesn't know that the curse is currently in Toby's warhammer, and that's what kind of gives it a sort of weightlessness to it. But the fact that Toby is in fact swinging around a warhammer, regardless, that would absolutely tire somebody out. Regardless of whether or not it had very little weight to it or not, it will eventually wear someone out. So Jim does kind of have a little bit of a point. But in case they do point, but of course, Toby points out that obviously with Angor Rot, he doesn't really mind having to wield the warhammer, pointing out that obviously they're going to need that obviously with warhammer and Shadow Walker and Shadow Dancer at his back, he points out that Angor Rot stands no chance of coming after Jim again, so that they can protect him. And of course Jim returns the sentiment, but also points out that obviously he's decided Shadow Dancer on as Claire's nickname and code name, and does point out that obviously he seems to have not really run that idea past Claire yet. So, and of course points out that she's probably not going to like that name very much. So, but also does point out that they're currently in school, and he does point out that it is probably one of the safest places to be, pointing out that Angor Rot both A, can't come out in the daytime, and B, can't attack Jim when he's surrounded by all of his friends. So for that reason, he points out that it's probably a safe place in school. But in case we quickly find out that no, it's not. So here's where the episode officially starts. We find out, as we see, Eli and Steve go about their usual antics, where Steve stuffs Eli in a locker, even though Eli protests, pointing out that he's already done Steve's math homework and also wired some lunch money into his account. So he points out that obviously they did that. Obviously they can probably skip the whole locker stuffing today, but of course, Steve then proceeds to point out that there's a certain whole hierarchy in school about how things work, and then proceeds to ask Eli who the top dog is, and of course, Eli predictably points out that Steve is top dog, and satisfied, he then proceeds to close the locker with Eli in it, and then proceeds to go about his business, and goes to the school washroom, where he then proceeds to admire himself in the school bathroom. He admires himself in the mirror, and also then proceeds to point out that to himself, I should mention, but he proceeds to reiterate to himself that there is a hot blonde in one of his classes that he wants to ask to the spring fling, and is currently making a plan to figure out her name so he can ask her out. And but of course, as he's doing that, Angor Rot is revealed to be in the sewers underneath the school, and in keeping with the whole story about the pixies, being a hallucinogenic creature that causes visions. Angor Rot, he's got a full box. He's got a large backpack full of them. And, it's more of a crystal, but he's got a large backpack full of pixies, and he then proceeds to set them loose in the school, right as Steve is entering the bathroom to kind of admire himself and make his plan to ask out the hot blonde in his class. And of course, one of them then proceeds to predictably fly into Steve's ear. And this of course causes Steve to start hallucinating, but he doesn't fully understand what's happening at first. He just continues to go about his business as if everything is normal. But then somebody walks out of the stall, pushes him out of the way so they can use the bathroom as well. And of course, Steve is insistent to know who that person is, but then they quickly find out that the person in the mirror is in fact another Steve, which of course then proceeds to introduce himself as such, as all the things Steve is known for, being captain of the football team. He's currently in line to become Spring Clean King, and all the other things that Steve is known for being just in general being a pretentious dick. But in general, just introduces himself the way that Steve would be expected to introduce himself. And of course, Steve immediately panics, pointing out that he can't be Steve because he's Steve. But then a third Steve proceeds to walk up and tells him that not anymore, and that he's not special. Which of course causes Steve to go into a bit of a panic. And of course he immediately runs through the hallway and immediately opens the locker where he stuffed Eli, only to discover that Eli is also Steve. And this is where kind of the hint, where because they show Eli being Steve in the locker, but they also show real people behind him, which establishes that it's an illusion. We're only seeing things from Steve's perspective, but the heavy implication implies that the pixies are designed to show somebody their worst fear. Obviously, with Strickler, it showed Balar coming back and demanding to know why Strickler left his father in the Darklands to rot. With Steve, it's the fact that Steve isn't special in the slightest, and he's just not, and he's worried that people will realize that, hey, there's nothing special about Steve Paltrock. He's just a normal dude that is just generically handsome, and that there's nothing interesting or special or unique about him. And of course that winds up becoming Steve's, whole panic attack thing. He starts seeing more and more people in the hallway being hallucinated as himself, And he panics and starts running through the hall, exclaiming that he's not that he's Steve and that he's special and that nobody else can be him. And of course, Jim and Claire are currently walking through the hallway. Jim is currently walking her to class when they wind up seeing Steve just run through the hallway. At which point they ask Coach Lawrence what exactly is going on, and of course, wonders what all of that was about. And Coach Lawrence just points out that it's just SAT season and that at least one person cracks every year, and points out that Steve unfortunately was the winner of that. And at which point he then proceeds to walk away to go to his own class, to go to teach his own class. And obviously we know that's not what actually happened, but of course it's at this point where Jim then proceeds to walk Claire to class, and Jim does point out that obviously Toby decided to name her Shadow Dancer, which she points out is a little bit too generic because she doesn't really like the name, so she picks what she considers to be a much cooler nickname than what Toby picked out. And I don't remember it, but it's something with a bunch of lines scribbled and letters in it, which it's kind of funny, but of course, Jim points out that it is absolutely a far better name than what Toby picked out. Just, kind of kiss ass to her. But with that, she then proceeds to go into her history class, where she sits down, and then it's Claire's turn to become mind controlled by the pixies. And it's at this point where one of them proceeds to fly into her ear, as she's entering her history class, and Senior Ul is the one teaching the history class, and he's going about a historic landmark about a bridge, and which as Claire's sitting down taking notes, suddenly shifts to a talk about Killhead Bridge, which of course causes her to immediately perk up because that doesn't sound right to her. And sure enough, as she stands up, as she looks up, she discovers that she's completely alone in the class, and now Senior Ul, being the only other person in the class other than her, is now pointing out going into detail about the Battle of Killhead Bridge, and more specifically, with why Claire wasn't there to save her baby brother. And of course, then proceeds to go on to berate her and tell her that because of her, that her baby brother has been taken, and that's all her fault, and that she wasn't there to save her brother, which of course causes Claire to have a panic attack, and she runs out into the hallway in the middle of class. Might I mention, everybody else is just confused as to what happened, as why Claire suddenly had a panic attack, but she immediately starts wandering around the halls to try and clear her head, but then sees Enrique crawling around the halls and ceiling of the place, and she starts looking for him, and starts calling after him, and eventually she winds up opening a locker because she hears Enrique calling out into it, and it just opens into a large void, which she then proceeds to try and climb into to get to Enrique, And of course, this winds up becoming a bit of a recurring problem with everybody, because as the pixies slowly spread through the school, they start entering more and more people's ears and start, causing people to hallucinate. We only see a handful of them, but one of the funnier ones is that Mary currently thinks she's naked at school, and we just see a bunch of other people swimming, having panic because they're not going to make the swim team, about a couple of other things. They're all funny, but we only really get glimpses because they're not really the main focus of the episode. We only get glimpses of what's going on through their heads, and of course Steve and Toby, Jim and Toby, they see all of this, and they are a little confused as to what's going on, pointing out that it's almost like they almost have a waking nightmare, like a night terror in the middle of the day, and do proceed to wonder what exactly it is that's going on. But of course, Jim quickly reasons that whatever's going on, Strickler is most likely behind it, and they immediately go to his office, the principal's office, to immediately figure out what's going on. And of course, they quickly discover that because he was told by Angor Rot not to go to the school tomorrow, that obviously he's not here, and of course this causes this causes Jim and Toby to kind of freak out because they quickly realize that whatever's going on is currently spreading through the school. And but of course Jim is panicked, is kind of a little bit confused as to what to do. But Toby reassures him, pointing out that regardless of what happens, he'll still have old Warhammer to keep him company and keep him safe, because obviously they've already lost Claire. But it's this point where Pixie then proceeds to fly in and land on Toby's shoulder. And Jim, immediately realizing that what's going on, immediately slowly goes to grab a book, telling Toby that there's something on his shoulder, and that they and then he needs to just not move, and that he'll take care of it. But and he then proceeds to grab a book from Strickler's desk. But and so as Jim is trying to grab the book, it eventually flies around Toby's headspace, and eventually goes up his nose, which of course Jim immediately instructs him to try and blow it out, but Toby points out that he can't get it out, but then realizes this could actually work in Jim's favor, and proceeds to tell him that it's like all of those, all those movies where there's always an epidemic, as he describes it. It's one of those movies where there's an epidemic, and that Jim needs to figure out what's going on, and and of course they point out that it's obviously an epidemic, and that they're going to need to find the patient zero, and that Toby's going to be the patient zero. But of course he proceeds to tell. But of course, it's at this point where Toby then proceeds to slip into a hallucination, and of course, because it's been a recurring arc for him throughout the past several episodes now, Toby then proceeds to hallucinate that he and the mole are a couple and fully in love. And he proceeds to, and of course, it winds up being exactly as sappy as you think it would be. But it's at this point where as they're flying through, space, like those "we're in love," over the top love action sequences type things, which is what they were going for. It's this point where Toby asks the mole if it'll be his date to the spring fling, and then at which point he then proceeds to take the mole's head off to discover that it's actually his nana underneath, which is when it immediately delves into night territory, and he starts panicking. And of course, it's at this point where Jim then proceeds to realize that he's now lost all Warhammer. So he immediately calls Blinky for some advice. And Blinky is currently at Barbara's house. He's currently at Jim's house talking to Barbara, and they're just kind of walking. They're just kind of interacting a little bit, and Jim is trying, and Barbara's trying to get some sort of confirmation about how Jim is doing in terms of his emotional state and all those other things, and of course they're both having a cup of coffee while Blinky then proceeds to ask Barbara for some whipped cream, which she of course is a little confused because she points out that that's not usually the kind of cream you put in coffee, but of course he then proceeds to down the whole bottle instead of putting it in his coffee like he's supposed to, and she wonders if Jim is doing all right, and of course he initially misunderstands her and tells her that obviously he's reaching that age where his body's going to start changing, his voice is going to start changing, and that points out that it's natural and that she should be fine with it, but then she points out that's not what she was asking him to ask, if he's opened up more about his dad or anything else, and he points out that, and also the late nights, the sneaking out, the lying, and all those other things, but and of course Blinky points out that it'll be fine, and points out that they've broken through a lot of Jim's emotional roadblocks, and that there's probably not going to be anything to worry about. At which point he gets the call from Jim, who just tells him that people are hallucinating in the middle of the school, and tells him that he doesn't know what to do. At which point Blinky immediately excuses himself, claiming that it's President Eisenhower on the other end of the phone, which confuses Barbara a lot because obviously, President Eisenhower wouldn't be calling a school guidance counselor, but of course, at this point where Jim instructs them what exactly is going on about what's happening, and of course Blinky immediately goes into the whole scientific explanation for what's going on, but Jim points out that he doesn't really have time for the full textbook definition right now, and that he needs the cheat sheet, and at which point Blinky explains that it's pixies. And that pixies an epidemic of pixies has infected the school and is causing people to hallucinate. And of course he then proceeds to point out that the way pixies work is that they're normally trained to work as a diversion. they are designed to fly into someone's head and keep people from figuring out that they're being attacked by an enemy. And then realizes, after thinking about it for a minute, that likely means that Angor Rot is in the school somewhere. And sure enough, Jim, after hearing this, immediately runs out of Strickler's office to go and find Angor Rot. And what we find out is that Miss Janeth is it happened before Jim went into the office. I should mention I'm doing this a little out of order, but we find out that Miss Janeth tried to restore order, but then we find out what her worst fear is when a pixie flies into her head. And we find out that despite being the lead of the drama department, she has terrible stage fright and is panicked about doing well within her own on the stage performances on her own, which is, well, I mean, that makes sense. There's an old paraphrase called "Those who can do it can, and those who can't teach," and it seems to imply that Miss Janeth at one point tried to be an actor and failed, so now she just runs the drama department at the high school. So that kind of makes a little bit of sense. But of course, Jim eventually is running through the hallway, and eventually we do see Angor Rot, who eventually does find Jim in the halls, and does in fact get ready to confront him, and of course Jim immediately summon his armor to try and defend himself, but of course it's at this point where Angor Rot just does his usual trick where he takes away Jim's sword from him, and Jim, quickly realizing that his plan A is gone, immediately goes to his plan B, being his glaives, but of course there's an immediate backup plan, which is that as Angor Rot is about ready to engage Jim, it's this point where Steve just runs through the hallway, exclaiming that he's special. And it's just this point, and this line lives rent free in my head because I've seen this show before. But this line lives rent free in my head, I should mention, where Angor Rot grabs Steve to use him as a hostage and kind of keep Jim on the defensive. And it's this point where Steve lets out the phrase, "Don't kill myself, I'm special." But it's a funny line out of context. It's great. But of course, Jim, immediately realizing that he needs to save Steve, immediately sets his glaives loose, and the glaives immediately, and what we find out is that Jim is able to control his glaives psychically, like they're connected to, because the armor responds to his emotional state and can read his thoughts. Obviously, that means that the glaives, being an extension of his armor, are similarly able to listen to his thoughts, but because of that, it kind of takes a bit of a steep learning curve to learn, and Jim is still trying to figure out how to use his glaives. So he does wind up attacking Angor Rot briefly with them, which of course causes Angor Rot to drop Steve, and Steve runs off once again, screaming that he's special. At which point, but eventually Angor Rot does in fact knock them both into the walls, and quickly realizing that he's outmatched and doesn't know how to control his weapons, Angor Rot immediately grabs Jim and proceeds to tell him that he points out that Jim that even with his new fancy toys, that Jim is no real match for him. And obviously Jim can't call for help because everybody's stuck in a hallucination. But Jim quickly realizes that he may not be a match for Angor Rot. He does figure out somebody who is. At which point he successfully pulls his glaives out of the walls where they were stuck, and breaks open Angor Rot's backpack full of pixies, which immediately starts swarming his head. And of course, Jim uses this opportunity to escape. Meanwhile, Toby is currently, freaking out, running through the hallways, trying to get away from his quote-unquote Nana, which, at which point, he eventually arrives in the gym where the hallucination of his Nana then proceeds to peg dodgeballs at him, insisting that Toby give him a kiss or else, at which point she then proceeds to peg several dodgeballs at him, and in an effort to get away from his Nana, Toby accidentally runs into the wall, which dislodges the pixie that was in his nose, and which enables Toby to crush it. At which point he declares that the patient has in fact found the cure, and immediately runs off to go and find Claire, and does wind up stuffing some tissue paper up his nose, while Jim continues to try and get away from Angor Rot. And And of course, after seeing all the people hallucinate, he eventually tries to find the one that tries to find Claire and tries to hone in on where she is. And he does eventually find her, having stuffed herself inside a locker to try and find Enrique. And he immediately pulls her out, and of course she only sees him as Enrique and only hears him talking, but is also confused as to why Enrique can suddenly talk. And reasoning with her isn't going to work, he then realizes that what he has to do and realizes he has to smack Claire. But he also points out the very obvious problem with that, being that a gentleman is not supposed to hit a lady. But also points out that he's no gentleman, and eventually steals his nerves enough that he's able to, hit Claire. And of course, Claire doesn't appreciate being hit by Toby, and hits him back. But she then realizes, but she does thank him and ask him what's going on. And he points out that shall explain, but first they need to find Jim, and tells her to stuff some things up his nose so that they don't crawl back inside of her again, and so that pixies just don't climb back inside. And of course they immediately go to find Jim, who was currently inside the gym, he went to the gym while Toby was gone. But of course, as Jim is inside the gym, a pixie winds up flying inside his ear. At which point we find out what Jim's worst fear is. The Killerhead Bridge being opened, and Gunmar going free, and all of his friends being turned to stone as a result. All of his friends and loved ones just dying at the hands of Gunmar. And of course he does look around and mourns the loss of his friends and loved ones for a minute before remarking that none of it is real, and that's he needs to snap out of it and find a way to wake up. But of course he realizes that he can still hear the world around him, so he decides to hone in on his senses, so that he's not focusing on the illusion but on Angor Rot and his movements. And of course, it doesn't wind up being enough because obviously he can't really see where Angor Rot is. But of course Angor Rot but of course he can hear Angor Rot moving around him. So he can hear where he's talking from. But other than that, he's not really able to defend himself all that well. And eventually Toby and Claire do find Jim in the gym, but fittingly enough, they find Jim in the gym. I didn't think about that, but that's funny. But Angor Rot then proceeds to just shut the door and continues to confront Jim, and does tell them that there's no use fighting, and that he does proceed to point out that today, a whole day, should serve as a warning to Jim, that no matter where he goes and no matter who he's with, Jim will never be safe from Angor Rot. He will always find a way to actually close the difference from Jim, because he's absolutely attacked Jim in the gym, in his school, where he's supposed to be safe from Angor Rot because of all of his friends, but that obviously didn't work. And of course, Jim insists to know what Angor Rot is waiting for, and about what he hasn't decided to kill him yet. But it's this point where Angor Rot points out that obviously he's not worried about Jim, and points out that he doesn't know how long he's waited. And he then proceeds to tell him that he will wait as long as it takes to get back what's rightfully his. At which point, he knocks Jim on the floor, and of course, the pixie winds up flying out of Jim's ear. At which point, Angor Rot is able to successfully pin an arm behind Jim's back, and then proceeds to tell Jim that they don't have to be enemies. Although they are, but they don't have to be. He openly points it out, and does tell them that they do that while they're not there while they are at each other's throats, because he was tasked with killing him. He does point out that they do share a common enemy, and that they could work together and do something that could be an advantage toward both of them. And of course, Jim wonders what exactly it is that Angor Rot is talking about. At which point, he points out that's obviously they have a common enemy. Strickler has the Infernocopula, which of course means Angor Rot is forced to do his bidding, regardless of if he wants to or not. Which is kind of the reason why he attacked the school in the first place. Obviously, he tried to steal the Infernocopula away from Strickler at the start of the episode and failed miserably. But does point out that maybe Jim will have better luck because, he is the Trollhunter. And And of course, he then proceeds to tell Jim that in exchange for that, he'll be able to break the bond between Strickler and his mother, and then they'll be able, and it'll be something that they can both benefit from, win-win. But of course, Jim wonders why he should even trust Angor Rot, and Angor Rot then proceeds to shove him to the floor and also gives him his sword back, telling him that he really doesn't have much of a choice. Because obviously he points out that either it'll be the end of Strickler or the end of him, and that Jim just kind of has to make a choice on that. At which point he then proceeds to knock Jim out with a headbutt while he's disoriented, and then proceeds to leave and disappear back into the sewer, where he then proceeds to recall all of his pixies with a special chant. And admittedly, all of the way the episode ends is just kind of hilarious, because obviously everybody has been hallucinating and wasn't entirely sure what was going on. They were just stuck in their own little world a little bit. But the infinite scenarios where everybody comes out of their trance and realizes what's going on is hilarious. They just realize that they're in some sort of awkward, compromising position because they were hallucinating, which is funny. I think my most favorite is that obviously we find out that Steve, of course, he immediately recovers. One of the funnier ones is that Steve immediately recovers, and when he realizes that Eli isn't in the locker where he put them, he immediately puts him back and walks off, which is funny. But also, Miss Janet practicing Romeo and Juliet with a student, which winds up becoming incredibly awkward once they stop hallucinating and realize what's going on. And they just get up and walk away. It's funny. But, yeah, of course, after everybody just kind of calms down from their little pixie outbreak, we do find out that obviously everybody had their own hallucinations, and at which point everybody just kind of sits down and calms down for a bit, and it's this point where Mary asks Darcy what her hallucination was, and Darcy responds not to ask. At which point Steve points out that that's probably for the best, and that they should probably never mention any of what happens ever again. So. And of course, at this point, where Strickler, as interim principal, eventually shows up, and of course we meet the police officer from earlier, which I should probably picture him, and I don't even know his name, but I should probably picture him. But he should. But of course, the teacher, the police officer then proceeds to tell him that obviously that he believes there was some sort of gas leak, because obviously that's the only explanation that he can possibly come up with, because obviously it's a supernatural magical thing. Obviously nobody really is going to believe in magic or any of that, so he has absolutely no idea. But he pauses that it was probably some sort of gas leak based hallucination from the science lab, and he then proceeds to tell Strickler that he's very lucky that nobody was hurt. And of course when he sees that Jim is alive and well, Strickler just kind of angrily points out that yeah, he's very lucky indeed. At which point Blinky runs up, having gone on this whole off-screen journey where he tried to run from Jim's house all the way over to the school to try and help him out. And he only just gets there because he had to run the whole way, because we saw a little bit of it, but he tried to start a car, but didn't realize he needed the keys, so he had to run the whole way. And of course, it's at this point where he points out that also he only just now got there because he had to use the bathroom 3 times, and that ate up a lot of his time trying to get to Jim and help him out. And he does indeed point that out. And of course he then proceeds to, and of course Jim, remembering what Angor Rot told him, wonders if Blinky has heard of an artifact called the Inferno, and of course, spying it on Strickler's finger, Blinky does in fact confirm that he has heard of it, and he does point out that and that's just where that part of the episode ends. But it's at this point where Angor Rot, as he's kind of leaving through the sewer to try and kind of go back into hiding until he's ready to fight the Trollhunter again. And of course he is at this point where a stray pixie gets out of his backpack and into his ear. And it's at this point where we find out what Angor Rot's biggest fear is. That without a soul, he will eventually fall apart, decay, and fall apart into nothing. And And of course, Angor Rot immediately headbutts the wall to get that pixie out of his ear and crushes it in his with his bare hands, pointing out that he's tired of all these foolish hallucinations. At which point he walks off. So yeah, immediately there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, this episode is very much there's obviously a lot of funny scenarios where everybody got stuck in things, but there's a couple of interesting little story bits that come up. Obviously, Jim is worried about the possibility that he may fail as the troll hunter, and Dunmar may in fact escape and cause problems and just kill all of his loved ones. That's a very big established thing. And obviously, Toby is a little bit worried about his Nana. His is funnier than the others. His isn't really character development thing. And obviously, we know that Claire, through her hallucination, she is a little bit worried about. She feels a little bit guilty about the fact that they haven't been able to save her baby brother yet. Obviously, that's been a big thing and a big part of her character arc going into this second half of this season. She's obviously worried that she may never see her brother again, and she's worried that it may be in fact be her fault because she wasn't paying close enough attention to her brother to begin with. But obviously, Steve's is the most interesting of these. And obviously Angor Rot, of course, also thinking that he also worried that he may eventually decay into nothing because he no longer has a soul. But also Steve is an interesting one because Steve's is, well, we've already gone into great detail about Steve's, but Steve's is interesting because he believes that he's obviously very narcissistic. And then we do find out a little bit more about Steve and why he's such a narcissistic, asshole. But we do find out that Steve very much worries about the fact that he may in fact not be might be as much of a top dog as he thinks he is. He's a little bit worried about losing his quote unquote position, so to speak, and that's and obviously that's a normal teenager position to worry about, being in a clique, figuring out your position, figuring out who you're supposed to be in high school. That's what the high school was all about. But it's a very cringe time for a lot of people, I might add, because of that. But yeah, that's just what high school is. And Steve is very much worried that he may not, in fact, be as important and as much the center of attention as he would like himself to believe. He obviously puts on a brave face and believes that he is the most important character. He's the most important character in the show. He very much believes he's the most important character in the franchise at this point. But and of course, that's what his biggest fear is, that he's not. He thinks he's obviously struggles a lot with his self-esteem issues, and his hallucination definitely seems to build on that. And obviously that was a thing in the previous episode where once again though he plays it off as a prank, he does open up to Jim about his insecurities. At least a little bit as like an emotionally manipulative tactic, but still, it continues the thread that Steve has a lot of self-esteem issues, and obviously he struggles with them a lot. And that episode just kind of reinforces that no, that wasn't just a joke. That wasn't just a joke or a one-off bit that Steve was actually obviously having. That Steve was obviously trying to do to manipulate Jim into letting him win the Touch a Truckathon. He actually has deep-seated self-esteem issues, and that is just a part of his character. So, and which does go some way to explain why he's so narcissistic. He has major self-esteem issues, and he tries to put on a brave face of being like, hey, I'm the cool guy. I'm the big dog. I'm the top dog. I'm the alpha male. I'm the guy that's gonna beat your ass if you don't respect me. That guy, he's that kind of guy. And obviously that attitude is born from self-esteem issues, as I've said. But yeah, that's kind of one of the more interesting things I should point out. This is kind of where Steve's character arc starts to begin, because we do kind of get a glimpse into how Steve's mind works, and it is very interesting. And this is actually why Steve is probably my favorite character in this franchise, I should mention, because his character arc he has a very deep character arc that we see throughout the series. It's a very important thing that we see. But yeah, it's very interesting, and I do like talking about it. But in any case, that's gonna do it for my review of Trollhunters. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon. Link is down in the description. I very much appreciate it. Please go support me on that. And it does help me. It does help me financially, so I would appreciate that. Go and check out on my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays. Please go check that out. Not this week because I'm going somewhere, but so normally I stream Saturdays and Sundays over there, so please go check that out. And also, be sure to go and check out my Discord. I like connecting with new people over there, so please go hang out over there if you want to. Be sure to go and check out, and I guess be sure to go and check out the videos linked in the end screen as well, finally. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this video. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new, or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!